So this is our second Timely Topics session, and this afternoon we're focusing on feedback and retrieval. My name is Emma Weston. I'm the Maths Regional Lead Practitioner for the North. And I know that we don't currently have very many people on the call, so it might be that rather than doing things through a Jamboard, it might be that it's easier to type things into the chat or just to unmute and let me know if there are things you want to add into the conversation. Craig, are you able to unmute, or can I just check that you can actually hear at the moment? So either type something in the chat, or if you can unmute, just so I know where we're up to.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Okay, brilliant. Just because it might be easier for some of the bits where I was hoping for a bit of feedback from you, it might be easier just to do it talking through. So our initial question on the Jamboard was just to think about what retrieval practice actually is, because that's where we're going to start off, is thinking about retrieval practice. So what sorts of things do you think about when we talk about retrieval practice?
Retrieving prior learning or prior methods that have been shown to students.
Yeah, so how I was defining it is quite similar. Retrieval practice is any strategy that involves pupils retrieving material they've previously learned from their long-term memory. So the key thing there is that it's something that they've done previously. They have to actually have something that they're retrieving. And I can see that we've had a couple more people join us on the meeting, which is great. So I'm just going to double check that everyone can see the Jamboard. I'll just pause for a second and I'll pop that link back in the chat. There will be a couple of bits this afternoon where I want your ideas on the Jamboard, so I might prompt you to go there a bit later on. Okay, so when we're talking about retrieval practice, we're talking about any strategy that involves pupils retrieving material previously learned from their long-term memory. So I tell you what, since we have had a few more people join us, I'll just take a moment. If you could skip on to that second slide of the Jamboard, how does retrieval practice take place in your department? If you could maybe add a couple of post-it notes onto that. So on slide 2, so I'll pop a sticky note on just so you can see which one we're on about. If you could add some ideas about how retrieval practice takes place in your department at the moment. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, fab. So I can see a couple of suggestions put on there already. So retrieval practice takes place in do now tasks for some people, starter tasks of last lesson, last week, last month, or further back if relevant to the upcoming lesson. Computer lessons are scheduled in every 2 weeks using Maths Watch to recap. So we've got a couple of different ways, but the key one there seems to be that retrieval is often done at the start of a lesson, aside from those computer lessons. Okay, brilliant. So if we think about where this idea of retrieval practice came from then, so a lot of you will have read and be quite familiar with Barak Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction. And in that, he talked about daily review. So he said, it's an important component of instruction, can help to strengthen connections among the material we've learned, and that the review of previous learning can help us recall words, concepts, and procedures effortlessly and automatically when we need this material to solve problems or to understand new material. And I think we can see that that's quite key in maths. There are several quite foundational concepts and procedures that we want all of our pupils to be able to perform effortlessly and automatically so that they're able to build from those. And that we want to have really strong connections between different concepts in maths. So we need to think about what it is that we want our pupils to become automatic at doing. And I'll just put up a little bit more from Rosenshine. So he said the most effective teachers understood the importance of practice and began their lessons with a 5 to 8 minute review of previously covered material. So that idea of starting the lesson with something reviewing material that they've already learned has kind of been captured in a way in the ideas people put on the Jamboard about do now tasks and about starter tasks. And when planning for a review, teachers might want to consider which words, maths facts, procedures and concepts need to become automatic and which words, vocabulary or ideas need to be reviewed before the lesson begins. So inherent in that is also this idea of what prior knowledge we might need for the lesson. So someone was saying on their post-it about if there's something that's relevant to the upcoming lesson, making sure that that's a feature of their starter task, so that they've kind of primed that knowledge and understanding of pupils. Okay. So obviously Rosenshine's principles of instruction is not a particularly new idea, but it's something we've maybe become a lot more aware of recently, especially because of the book from Tom Sherrington. And in that he talked about daily review to support the development of fluency. So we're thinking about reactivating recently acquired knowledge. And a reason that we might want to do that is to reduce our reduce the cognitive load of our pupils. And we want that prior learning to be active in working memory if we're adding more layers of complexity. Otherwise, the connections that we want to engineer in the classroom just aren't going to happen. So we're reactivating that prior knowledge so that we're ready to build on that in our new learning in the class. Okay. So the reason that it matters is that knowledge, once successfully integrated into long-term memory, tends to remain there, but as time goes on and contexts change, we're frequently unable to access some knowledge that was readily accessible to us at some earlier point. And that human memory is altered by the act of retrieval. So the retrieved information becomes more retrievable in future than it would have been without such an act of retrieval. So that's from Robert Bjork, who's done an awful lot of work around memory in particular. So retrieval practice has featured very much in his work. So this builds on this idea that we're making our knowledge a lot more automatic and a lot more flexible so that we're then able to use it when we need it for something more complex. So definitely really important for our pupils to be able to do. But again, we can see that Robert Bjork was talking about this in 1988. So longer ago than some teachers in our departments have even been alive for. It's not a new idea. But teaching's become a much more evidence-informed profession over recent years, and we're now a lot more able to share and discuss ideas and research. So that's why maybe some of these ideas that actually people were researching quite a long time ago have become increasingly part of our day-to-day language that we talk about in the classroom with pupils or in our departments, and perhaps why ideas of retrieval practice becoming embedded as part of the start of our lesson. That's something that we've seen more and more. So another thing that we probably will have seen before is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. So this version of it is a slightly edited one taken from Doug Lamov's Teach Like a Champion. But we can see that when we learn information, if we don't have any repetitions, then we fall into this green part of the curve where we end up forgetting more and more of it. We have retained less information as time goes on, but with each repetition of that, we're then improving our knowledge again, getting it back up to the amount that we knew when we initially learned it. And then each time we're forgetting less and less, and it becomes easier for us to then revive that knowledge with the increased repetition. So this is why retrieval practice is such an important feature of our lessons. We also have the testing effect. So again, there's an awful lot of research into testing, and basically it tells us that this form of retrieval then aids later retention. So Roediger and Karpiker found that students who'd been tested following studying material were able to recall more of it 1 week later. So just so you can decode that graph, where it says SSSS, that means they had 4 periods of just studying some material that they needed to learn. Where it's SSST, that's 3 periods of studying followed by a period of testing. And then STTT means they studied the material and then they were tested, or they had 3 periods of testing just afterwards. So looking at the graphs, after 5 minutes, so 5 minutes after going through that process, whichever of the 3 categories they fell into, this is how much they were able to recall. So we can see that on that 5 minutes after assessment, the group that could recall the most were the group that had 4 study sessions. So basically that part of the graph is showing us that cramming works in the short term, but just look at the difference after 1 week. So that's really quite stark. The group that had 4 study periods and were initially able to recall more of the information than anyone else, they can recall less than half of what they could initially after 1 week. Whereas the difference in the amount that the group that had 3 testing sessions were able to recall, they've retained far much more of it. And again, evidence that this is something that people have been talking about for a very long time. William James in 1890 was already saying, albeit not with this kind of research, he'd noticed that it was better to be testing ourselves first rather than just looking at the book again or just studying. The difference is that in Roediger and Karpiker's experiment, they're actually using research to back up that hunch that William James had back in 1890. Now, there's an awful lot of research into the benefits of testing, and I've put a link on the end of this slide in case that's something you want to investigate a bit more. But I think the key thing here is we might want to use something like this to articulate the point that retrieval is helpful to our pupils so that they buy into it. Because it's not enough for us as teachers to understand that this is important and to know that this is a key feature of our lessons. This is also something that we want the pupils to value. Okay, so we mentioned already a couple of ways that people are using retrieval practice in the classroom. I'm just going to have another look at that Jamboard because I have a feeling that people put something else on while I've been talking. Yes, so people mentioning that homework of previous topics can be retrieval practice as well. And I know that some people specifically schedule homeworks so that they have spaced retrieval of topics. So bearing in mind when something will be covered in class and making sure that there's a gap before that then appears as the homework tasks. That is one way that retrieval could be used. Okay, so given that there's a few different ways that we might want to use retrieval in the classroom, maybe we need to think about some key principles that are going to be effective. So first is that retrieval practice should involve everyone. So all pupils should be retrieving if they're going to gain the benefit of this, not just a few pupils or one at a time through questioning. We want everyone to be truly involved. We need to make checking of these retrieval practice tasks accurate and easy. So students need to know if they're right or wrong. They need to know which topics they know well and where they have gaps. So making sure that answers are shared to any retrieval practice tasks. Students must genuinely be retrieving from their own memory if they're going to gain the benefits of this testing effect. So not from their books, not from a knowledge organiser, and not from their peers. They need to be actively doing the thinking in order for these connections to be strengthened. We want to vary the diet where possible. And we'll have a look at how we might do that in a moment. Sherrington, in his book about Rosenshine's Principles of Instructions, in talking about daily review, he suggests mix up the use of teacher-led self-quizzing, written and verbal quizzing, self-explanation, telling the story, multiple choice questions, open response tests, rehearsing explanations, summarising, creating knowledge maps, demonstration, and performance of learned techniques, routines, and procedures. Now, in reading out that long list, it might be that there are some that you think, I'm not sure that's really something I would want to use in my classroom for maths. But there are others that you might think, actually, yes, we're using those all the time. So but even amongst that list that contains some that you might not want to use for maths, perhaps, there's still plenty of variety in how we can ask pupils to retrieve knowledge. It should be time efficient. So a really good retrieval technique can be used repeatedly in a time efficient manner without dominating the whole lessons. So that includes checking answers right at the beginning when I was explaining about Barak Rosenshine's idea of daily review. He mentioned about effective teachers doing this for between 5 to 8 minutes. And actually, if we're doing that, then the whole thing, including checking answers, it certainly shouldn't be more than 10 minutes. And that's already quite a significant portion of the lesson if you think about it. We need to make sure that pupils actually have something to retrieve. So that means we need to have the balance right so that we're able to spend plenty of time actually teaching them the content. Otherwise, they won't have anything to retrieve next time. And it needs to be workload efficient as well. So thinking about this, students can check their own work here. We don't need to be marking everything for them. And actually, if it's part of their routine, it's going to become more time efficient because they will naturally sit down, get on with maybe a do now, if that's part of our retrieval routine. And it means that when you're going through the answers, once they're in the habit of checking what they've done, then that process should become quite slick. Okay, so given what we've talked about so far to do with retrieval, if we think about some specific knowledge that we want our pupils to retrieve, so rules about angles on parallel lines, how could we ask them to do this so that we've activated that knowledge ready to build on and use for something in our lesson? So I'm going to stop talking for a moment. I want you to have a bit of a think and either post your ideas into the chat about how we might ask them to retrieve that knowledge, or if it's easier for you to unmute, that's fine as well. So I'm looking for suggestions about how we could ask pupils to retrieve rules about angles on parallel lines. Okay, so I can see a suggestion from Craig in the chat about repeated choral response. Could you be a bit more specific, please, about what sort of thing you might want them to repeat? I can see another suggestion, a blank diagram where they fill in what they know or remember. Any other ways people can think of about how we could retrieve rules about angles on parallel lines? So they've already learnt about these rules and had some chance to use them before. We're just wanting to remind them of that and refresh that knowledge. Oh, there's a controversial one in the chat. So asking for the letters that associate to the rules Z for alternate. Now, I would prefer to be focusing in on the key mathematical vocabulary there, and maybe asking to associate a diagram with the rules about alternate. So maybe something along the lines of, draw me a diagram that indicates alternate angles. I would be moving away from using the letters because that can become quite confusing. A blank transversal and parallel lines, no angles marked. What could be the question? Okay. Yes, I quite like what I'm imagining for the kind of blank version. Maybe a if this is the answer, what could the question be, or building your own question around that. Okay, so Craig's given some clarification around repeating specific rules, e.g. alternate angles are equal. So getting students to repeat that as a choral response to really hammer that idea home. Okay, so we've got some ideas from the chat. Let's have a look at some ideas of different types that might add on to that. So we could just ask them to list all the rules they can remember for angles on parallel lines, or that might benefit from a blank diagram to be filled in as well. We could, just focusing in on alternate angles here, we could ask them to decide whether each of these diagrams show angles that are alternate or not. So starting to do a bit of classification. We could just give them some questions to complete where they have to use these rules. So as well as finding the missing angle here, I would want them to state what type of angles it is that they are seeing. Or we could use multiple choice questions. So this one is from diagnostic questions. And that could give us quite a quick idea of whether or not pupils are remembering the rules accurately, as well as maybe identifying a few misconceptions along the way. But we can see that there's a variety in the different activities that we could use and the different question types that we could give pupils, so that we can check that prior knowledge and so that we can make sure that they're retrieving this to build on. Okay, so we have already on the Jamboard had a little look about how people are using retrieval practice and when it takes place. But we've not necessarily looked at how we decide what's being retrieved, beyond maybe some people suggesting about prior knowledge. But I'm getting the sense that that's not always what we're using for retrieval practice, because there was a mention of homework and using MathsWatch to recap in computer room lessons. That's not necessarily prior knowledge that you're using in that lesson itself. Okay, I'm just wondering if anyone has any ideas about how they decide exactly what it is that they're going to ask about in this retrieval practice. Feel free to unmute if it's easier than typing in the chat. Okay, I feel like we're drawing a bit of a blank on this one. So, okay, thinking about maybe some of the things that I've seen as I've gone around different schools and different departments. So in some departments, people are using ready-made resources like the Corbett 5 a day or the Maths Box Skills Check. So in those cases, the specific things that are being retrieved aren't necessarily dictated by when they were last taught. It might just be these are really key skills that we know we need to check up on every single time. But sometimes I'm seeing people making use of diagnostic questions to activate prior knowledge. Like we mentioned before, it might be prior knowledge that they know is going to be essential for that lesson. In some departments, they have a schedule for spaced retrieval. So they've created their own retrieval practice questions based on a schedule of these are the topics that were taught, say, last term or 6 weeks ago. These are the ones that we want to make sure that we're reviving that understanding of and making sure that they become more secure. And while I was talking about that, I can see that there's a couple of suggestions in the chat about prior knowledge checks at or prior to the beginning of a topic. And also that sometimes it could be a low stakes whiteboard question. Absolutely, yeah. So it doesn't always need to be a long drawn out thing. In fact, it's better if it's quite a quick, slick and efficient routine. Another thing to mention is that for maths in particular, we're really lucky because there are websites such as Maths Whiteboard or MathsBot where we can generate questions quite quickly if there is a specific topic that we feel that we want to retrieve. Okay. And another thing to mention is it doesn't necessarily always need to be at the start of the lesson as well. It might be that actually we're moving on to a new section of our lesson that requires certain knowledge that we need to revive there and then, or it might be that we want to have a low stakes quiz towards the end of the lesson. So retrieval practice can actually take place at any point in the lesson. It's just that it's perhaps convenient and maybe easier to build into the routine if it's happening at the start of the lesson, and that having that as something that students do quite automatically. Yeah, so people have mentioned about exit tickets. That could be a part of your retrieval practice. Okay. So a few problems and pitfalls that could be fallen into here. So firstly, in order to practice retrieval, pupils must actually have something in their memories to receive. So by this, I mean pupils need to have practiced topics thoroughly. And linked to this, we've got the potential issue of retrieval practice starters dominating lesson time, and that could limit the amount of independent practice pupils gain on new learning. It's sometimes the case that we feel as though we need to move on really quickly in maths because we know we've got an awful lot of content to cover in our curriculums. And if we're not careful, we run the risk of pupils not getting enough practice that knowledge is going to be really secure. And then we're wondering why they're struggling to retrieve it at a later date, when actually we just needed to reinforce it more at the time. So linked with that, we want to make sure that our pupils are making quality memories, so getting plenty of practice of a variety of types. So confidence and fluency first, but then also moving into reasoning and problem solving to make sure that the content that we're teaching is really secure for pupils. Oh, yeah, and I often say don't practice until you get it right, practice until you never get it wrong. And I wonder if we're if we're reflecting on what we see in our departments, are we seeing everyone giving pupils that degree of practice? Time is a big issue. So I've said already that we know we've got an awful lot to cover, but we don't want a retrieval practice starter to end up dominating the lesson time. Maybe in your next couple of lessons, think about at what point you're starting to move on to the main topic and what proportion of the lesson have you been able to use for that new learning. It's not necessarily just a starter. We need to make sure that what's being retrieved has been retrieved correctly and our pupils able to have some feedback on how successful their retrieval has been. Who's doing the retrieving? Are the pupils actually doing the retrieving themselves, or are they sitting there doing what Adam Boxer kind of calls busy work and busy tricking? So looking like they're doing lots of retrieval practice when actually they're just writing out a question and waiting for somebody to go through some answers with them. Do pupils understand how to use it themselves? So when we think about, and I know we've got year 11s doing mocks at the moment, so this really is quite timely, how I would want my year 11 pupils to revise maths is to test themselves by doing some maths and checking if they're doing it correctly. So essentially, to revise maths, I want my pupils to do some retrieval practice. When we're doing retrieval practice in class, we're kind of modelling to pupils, this is a really useful tool, and this is something that is helping you to secure your memories and to make sure that the things that you want to be automatic and fluent in, you actually are. But we also want them to realise that that's something they can do themselves. They don't need to wait for us to do it in the class, and we want that to be how they revise. If we're sharing those messages with them about this is how you revise maths, are we making that link between what we're doing with them in the classroom and what they can be doing themselves? And do we ask pupils to retrieve some topics but not others? With my hand on my heart, I cannot tell you that I have ever used much retrieval practice on things like constructions, because things like the equipment I would need to give out is often a bit of a barrier. And am I doing my pupils a disservice, or is there a time and a place to get them to practice those skills? Something to consider. Okay, so thinking about something to consider. Now, there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong in doing a retrieval starter of questions that come from last lesson, last week, last month, last year. But what could go wrong with this kind of setup? Have a little think, and if you can think of anything that we need to bear in mind or anything that might be an issue here, pop it into the chat. Okay, so we've got a couple of suggestions in the chat that are on a similar theme. So student being absent from class, last lesson, last week, etc., or new students. So that kind of means that there isn't any learning to retrieve the knowledge from. That could be a potential issue. But I think even if our students have been in last lesson, last week, last month and last year, even if they've done that before, we need to be careful that this format, which on the surface, it looks like a valid interpretation of retrieval practice, and actually used well, it could do the job. But there's a real danger here that the format can take precedence over the substance of what we're doing. The time taken to skip between these 4 different topics, especially if because it's been a long time since pupils last worked on some of them, they maybe can't remember them at all. I'm thinking particularly of the last year one. And that can then mean that the time taken is quite great, and it means that maybe pupils are needing to seek help, which reduces the effect of retrieving. We then might feel the need to spend a lot of time going over how to do those questions to fix it. But then by the time we start our lesson, pupils might already be switching off. They might have had a bit of cognitive overload from going through all those 4 different topics. Might not even be relevant for the current lesson. So we've kind of used up all of that time and all of that effort in getting them to understand these 4 topics that we're not necessarily then building from. And then there's a danger that we might then next lesson be looking at 4 quite different things, so they're not getting that repetition. So to be used with caution. Okay, I'm noticing that we're already at 8 minutes past 4, and we also need to talk about feedback. Before I move on to feedback, I'm just wondering if anyone has anything else they'd like to add or ask in terms of retrieval practice. So either into the chat if there's anything you want to add or ask, or if you unmute. Okay, so I'm not seeing anyone unmuting or adding into the chat, so I'll assume that we're happy to move on to look at feedback. So we're really lucky in maths because a lot of the research that's been done on feedback has actually been done into feedback specifically in maths. As with the slides on retrieval practice, you might have noticed there are a couple of bits linked in. I've also added some links on if there's anything you want to read into a bit further when we look at feedback as well. But Hattie and Timperley said that feedback is information provided by an agent regarding aspects of one's performance or understanding, reducing the discrepancy between what is understood and what is aimed to be understood. So in our contexts, it's information provided by the teacher generally, or other pupils if we're doing peer assessment, reducing the discrepancy between what is understood and what's aimed to be understood. So we're trying to lessen that gap between where the pupils are now and where we want them to be. We've got 3 main functions: cognitive, changing achievement; motivational, changing interest; or metacognitive, changing self-regulation. And we need to bear those in mind when we're giving feedback. We need to have in mind what we're actually aiming to achieve with the feedback. And we also need to bear in mind that marking is not feedback. Marking is just a small part of feedback, and if it's not useful, then don't do it. So by that I mean, well, partly, I mean in terms of adding in lots of written comments or doing acknowledgement marking. So I'll just read to you a bit from Mathematics Inside the Black Box, where they said useful comments written every 2 to 3 weeks were more useful than a mark on every piece of work. So hopefully you're not in a situation where you're feeling the need to have a tick on every page of a pupil's book, because that doesn't have impact. Feedback is only successful if students use it to improve their performance, and actually having that kind of useful verbal feedback or a comment to them could be a lot more useful than just ticking a page to say that we've seen it. So the Education Endowment Foundation has done a lot of work on feedback and collating a lot of research evidence. And one of the reasons that over the course of my career there's been quite a high focus on giving feedback is that they found that feedback has very high impact for very low cost based on extensive evidence, and the evidence really is quite extensive on feedback. And they found that on average this has a potential impact of 6 months improvement. However, we need to bear in mind that not all feedback is going to have that impact. This is quite a kind of broad brush stroke comment on feedback overall. So we need to be really careful about what we're actually describing here and what we mean. So some things to consider. Again, from EEF, they have given some recommendations about how we can make our feedback more effective. So firstly, if we lay the foundations for effective feedback. So guess what? High quality initial instruction is really key here. Because actually, if our initial instruction is doing the job that we need it to do, then we don't actually need the feedback to be doing as big a repair job and filling in lots of gaps. So we need to make high quality initial instruction the key foundation of everything that we do. We need to deliver appropriately timed feedback that focuses on moving learning forward. So by that I mean, we need to think about what it is that we actually want to have an impact on. Feedback focusing on a learner's personal characteristics, so telling someone that they're a brilliant mathematician, or feedback that offers only general and vague remarks, so something like well done, is a lot less likely to be effective. We need to give pupils some specific guidance for how they can improve their work. We need a plan for how pupils will receive and use feedback. And we need to bear in mind that pupils' motivation, self-confidence, and trust in their teacher all impact on how effective our feedback is. We need to consider how to use purposeful and time-efficient written feedback. So written feedback can be quite labour and time-intensive. And actually, any time we're asking teachers to do something, there's an opportunity cost, because teacher time is a real finite resource. So a few years ago, there was a real focus on things like triple marking and comments like feedback should be a dialogue between the teacher and the student. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't remember ever having any significantly effective written dialogue between me and a student. But I do remember that there's been an awful lot of times where I can swiftly give pupils feedback on what they're doing that then changes what they do next. So verbal feedback while I'm circulating probably has way more impact than me spending hours at home writing lots of comments on books. Verbal methods of feedback can improve pupil attainment and maybe more time efficient. So like I was just saying, and actually, if you dig a bit deeper into some of the EEF research, you'll find that they found on average written feedback improved student progress by about 5 months, whereas verbal feedback by about 7 months. Now, obviously, we know that not all feedback is created equal, and so there's some specifics to drill down into there, but straight away we can see that verbal feedback can be really efficient and really effective. And particularly if we're in a leadership position within our teams, we need to think about student workload and make sure that anything we're doing is going to be a good use of their time. And You can see here I've made a bit of a stand against verbal feedback stampers. So if we're talking about using verbal feedback because it's more time efficient and might improve workload, let's not increase our workload by getting people to stamp bits of paper. If it's not improving our students' understanding, then there is no reason for us to be doing it. Okay, and a couple of words of caution. So those feedback studies tend to show high effects on learning, but some studies show that feedback can have negative effects and actually make things worse. So we really do need to be careful about the exact way that we are implementing these things. So let's have a look at what the research says. So comparing student performance to predefined criteria or their previous performance has greater impact on achievement and is more motivating than comparing students to each other. So comparing student performance to predefined criteria could be something along the lines of comparing your student performance to a mark scheme or their previous performance. So thinking about, I've got my kind of year 11s are doing mocks head on. Whenever students sit a mock paper, I might be thinking about where are you now in relation to where you were at the end of year 10? And if we do this again between now and the next set of mocks, where might you be then? Or anytime they do a paper, how far away are you from your goal? So comparing themselves to themselves or some predefined criteria rather than starting to compare themselves to each other in the class. Marking answers doesn't help with error correction and can be demotivating. And it gives little incentive for students to write logical arguments, practice using notation, or explain decisions. So if all we're doing is marking things right or wrong, that could be an issue. Instead, we need to be making sure that we're giving students the kind of feedback that helps them to write logical arguments, practice using notations, explain decisions. So making sure that we're actually giving them something extra on top of just marking answers. And remember, that doesn't always need to be written down, although it might be that there are some annotations that we might make when we're marking work that can kind of give some pointers. So rather than just marking something wrong, maybe circling something that might be giving them an indication about how they can correct it. Giving grades only can have negative effects, possibly more so for lower attaining students. And I think we can probably understand why that might be, because if I'm a high attaining student and I'm told my grade, just my grade, but that grade is something that I'm quite happy to hear, I'm probably feeling quite good about myself. Whereas if I'm a lower attaining student and all I'm told is what grade I am, and that grade makes me feel awful, I've got no information about how I'm going to improve that grade. I've got no indication about what it is that I might have messed up on or where my gaps might be. So I can't just be given a grade. I need to have some sort of idea about what I need to do that's going to improve that grade. And giving feedback on something that isn't a critical dimension of the goal, and I've put in there as an example, presentation, is problematic. So if I'm giving feedback on presentation, that means the presentation is the thing that the pupil knows how to improve, which is fine. And I might want them to improve their presentation, particularly if their layout of their maths is shocking and really difficult for both me and them to follow. However, if the goal I actually want is for them to improve their maths, I need to be giving them feedback on the maths itself. So let's have a look at some potential comments that we could give pupils about their work and think we're actually feeding back about and what the likely impact is. So if I'm saying brilliant work, what's the likely, well, what am I feeding back about and what's the likely impact here? Again, feel free to type into the chat or to unmute. Yeah, it's only motivational here. I mean, I'm not saying don't give pupils praise about what they're doing. If they are doing brilliant work, then, by all means, let them know. But there's nothing here that's going to move them on. Yeah, maybe something more specific. What exactly was brilliant? Maybe how could it be even, this might not even be a word, but how could it be even brillianter or even more brilliant? Even our best students still have something that they can improve. Correct question 3. What could be a problem with that? Okay, so I can see possibly gives them a deeper task to complete. I'm not sure if that's related to this one or the previous one, or if I'm misunderstanding. If I'm telling them to correct question 3, I'm wondering if they've got it wrong, how do they know how to correct question 3? So it might be that it is quite vague, and I'm wondering how they're going to understand more now that means that they're actually able to make that correction. Show working out. What's the likely impact here? Or what do you think might be a potential issue? I like Craig's comment of I need a rubber stamp that says this. Yeah, it's something I feel like I have written an awful lot in my career or told students to do an awful lot in my career. And maybe one of the reasons I was banging my head against a brick wall with it is that they didn't actually realise exactly what working out they were needing to show. So I think, again, this is something that, because we could end up writing it in an awful lot of books or on an awful lot of assessments, really, this needs to be combined with modelling exactly what working out we want them to show for those types of questions. Yeah, we're kind of assuming that the student knows what the working out should look like. Sometimes if they're not showing it, it's because they just don't actually know what they need to show. Okay, whereas if we're saying underline headings, I'm wondering if I'm on a bit of a lag because I can see more answers coming through for the last one. Okay, so yeah, I'm wondering if my chat is maybe lagging behind a little bit, because I'm seeing things coming through about how to make sure that pupils are then able to show their working out. If we're saying underline headings, again, it might be a thing that we want pupils to do, but it's not going to help them improve their maths in particular. Okay. So, key words of wisdom from Dylan William. The only thing that matters is what the student does with the feedback. If the feedback you're giving your students is producing more of what you want, it's probably good feedback. But if your feedback is getting you less of what you want, it probably needs to change. And it sounds like such common sense when he says it. And actually, I wonder if there's a case for us being a bit reflective every now and again and thinking about, is this feedback doing what we want it to do? Another thing to bear in mind is it's all well and good us assuming how our feedback is being received by pupils, but the thing that's really going to tell us the most is if we ask them, is the feedback that we're giving actually helping? So I know that we're running short of time, so I'm just going to go to a couple of key ideas to round things off. So effective feedback gives focused information on performance against clearly defined goals. So thinking about that idea of having predetermined criteria. Verbal feedback can be effective when used well. Peer and self-assessment can be effective too, but if we're using this, students need to have really clear information. So again, that really clear predefined criteria. And giving students grades giving students grade only may be ineffective. Specific and immediate comments about their processes are more effective. And I can see that from some of the messages in the chat. We're thinking about how we can be really specific about errors that we're spotting, or how to make sure that pupils know what working out needs to be shown in their work. And something that we'd not really mentioned so much, there is a study from Weld that older students in particular could find model answers really powerful. So that might feed into some of this idea of showing them really clearly how we want things laid out or what the working out should look like, but also being able to compare their answers or a peer's answers with a model answer. Okay, so I appreciate that we've kind of rattled through quite a lot there, and there's been an awful lot of me talking. There are some links in the presentation if this is something that you want to dive into a little bit more. But I'll also stick around for a few minutes as well if people have anything else that they'd like to ask about, or any questions you want to put in the chat, or any further comments about this. But other than that, I will stop the recording now.